Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to LogRhythm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With Next-Gen SIEM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, LogRhythm provides security made smarter. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. We've heard from our listeners that you love our content, but there's sometimes just too much of it, and it can be overwhelming. Go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. Click the button to join the listener list, and we are working on getting you the content that you care about. We will also be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia, October 10th through the 11th. EC Council is offering our listeners a 15% off discount code to their bootcamp courses or workshops. Visit securityweekly.com/Hacker Halted to register today. That brings us to the enterprise security news. I thought it was interesting. We talked a little bit about Linux and Windows and Linux inside Windows and that kind of thing. Of course, Microsoft has made the announcement that I believe the latest announcement centered around it was kind of not a full Linux kernel. Now it's going to be a full Linux kernel included inside of Windows, which I really think they worked. My conspiracy theory is they worked with Docker, or Docker worked with Microsoft to push this change, because now Docker desktop for Windows is going to switch to the new Windows subsystem for Linux 2, which I believe is the one that uses the full Linux kernel, so that you can get better Docker support on Windows, which I thought was interesting.
I'm hoping that the new version, the new Windows subsystem for Linux, will work better and smoother. It seems like they're moving to it. Basically, you can't tell the difference between the running in the Windows environment or the Linux environment on your Windows desktop. It's an interesting path forward to me on a Microsoft system, but it should make it nice for running things like Docker or other Linux commands. And for somebody who likes to type VI a lot, I'll take it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it's Microsoft's ploy to get, continue and get better adoption for Windows for those that may have, like myself, have gone to Linux. Certainly, their Surface platform is awesome. And that could be some of the features that power users need, right? I can run full-blown Linux without dual booting, without a VM, and have better Docker support, and use the Surface, right? Because those things are pretty awesome.
But doesn't it kind of double the amount of patching and other kinds of administration that you're going to have to do?
That's a great point, April. Now, you've got two operating systems that are running all the time, right? It's not like a VM where you can shut it down and snapshot it or whatever. It's running all the time. So yeah, it would conceivably, the same vulnerabilities would exist, right? And especially if it's running a full-blown Linux kernel.
Yeah, and with the number of changes that happen with a lot of the open source tools that are included in many of the distros, it seems like there'd be a lot of updates.
Yeah, because you got Windows and Linux up to, and I mean, Linux has had some pretty major vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. Exim for one. there was a kernel vulnerability this week with some of the TCP/IP handling, specifically TCP handling, selective acknowledgements in the MSS. So, yep.
It also increases the attack surface because if there's if you're training vulnerabilities to own a machine, then you're going to be able to use both the Windows and Linux vulnerabilities. And if it is a server, it's probably not being updated as much as it should.
Yeah, it's another great point, April. We gotta have you back on the show more often. You're way smarter than I am. I was like, this is cool. I'm like, wow. So when I talk with folks about Linux malware is they'll often say, like Linux malware, number one, doesn't have to be as stealthy because there's not as many tools that are looking for some of the techniques. It also a lot less customized Linux malware because mostly they're living off the LAN. I mean, if you've got Bash and the GNU utilities, there's possibilities are pretty much endless for what you can do in terms of creating any type of backdoor and being stealthy, right? I think on Windows, they've got to develop and have a code base and maybe some other language to get that functionality. A lot of the Linux malware is really just utilizing what's there for Linux. Now that that's available on Windows, you wonder if attackers or pen testers now are like, well, my payload for my Windows systems is really just a Linux payload.
And what about whitelisting? Does that mean you have to whitelist applications twice?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know which kernel wins, right? Like which, ASLR, which, protections, like are there protections in Windows that can protect you against Linux or vice versa? That's a really good question. Not sure.
I'm still back on, could my Windows malware simply call the Windows subsystem for Linux as the exploit path or not? And like April said, I'm wondering how many people are going to forget to patch that Linux kernel. I'm reminded of a guy who tried to tell me his Fedora box was more secure than the other brands of Linux we wanted to run because he was applying 200 patches a day. That tracks, right?
Not the best measure of security, for sure. Couple of articles on containers. There's an article on runtime container security, which is interesting. There were some announcements on there as well. It was Aqua that had made the announcement that they're it looks like on the fly, identifying vulnerabilities inside of containers and then allowing you to automatically block them, to kind of speak to your automation point, which is something I thought existed, but they're touting it as new. Vulnerability Shield, solution for detecting and blocking attempts when container vulnerabilities face potential exploitation, which we've seen a couple of those in the past few weeks. And okay, moving right along. Netskope introduces Zero Trust Secure Access to private enterprise applications. Netskope does a great job of mostly like third-party and SaaS solutions that can take advantage of the platform. And it looks like they've added the ability to secure access to some of your own applications, even if they're hosted in public clouds as well as on premise as well, which is pretty cool.
What's the overhead going to be?
And that's Matt's issue with it, Lee, is vendors such as Netskope, right, rather than going off to the individual cloud services or SaaS applications, they basically funnel everyone through like the Netskope kind of cloud, right, to proxy that, to make sure that security is being applied and that you're not using applications that you shouldn't. We've got some really smart ways, like on people's phones and such, that they can proxy that regardless of what application you're using, right? So users don't leak something like a Dropbox share and leak out secrets, right? They force you to use whatever secure file sharing that they have. I think technology, bandwidth, and software and hardware and otherwise has allowed for that to happen. Of course, it still could be a limitation, but I think that technology's come a long way. But many, side with you on that one, Lee, and think that funneling everyone through basically a private cloud for everything could be problematic. I mean, it's the same thing with encryption, right? When we encrypt it, we can't see into the data. If connections on your network aren't going through a single point, then you can't monitor them. So that's the struggle in the enterprise for sure.
My biggest concern with the proxy model is how do we make sure the traffic really gets there? And it does seem to kind of counter cloud, that you're going to take the stuff designed for ubiquitous distributed access and run it through a single point. But you could replicate that. But I was talking to one vendor, and they were talking about, well, what you need to do is configure all the endpoints with our proxy as their basically you define their proxy on each endpoint, which didn't seem like a good scaling model. And they said, well, we can poison your DNS, and that's not really any better. But I think this is emerging. We need that security level. So it'd be very interesting to see how this goes forward and where we can go with this kind of a solution.
Absolutely.
Is it decrypting all of the traffic then?
I believe it can. My briefing with them was a while ago, so I apologize, but I believe it does handle encrypted traffic as well. That's a feature I think you can enable.
That's a lot of trust.
It is, yeah. Because the thing is, what if someone compromises the security platform, right? That could be bad.
There's definitely a risk trade-off.
Yeah, for sure. Red Seal's launching a new suite of professional services, which I think is kind of interesting. I think I'd much prefer Red Seal to come out with more product-type security things. It's always been an interesting balance to see companies, go between having a product and having professional services. I thought it was interesting that they're going more down the new suite of professional services route. They do have a relatively new CEO. I think that was announced at RSA this year. And they've got an interesting approach on the kind of like breach simulation or attack path simulation, as they do it by collecting the configuration from all of your devices and simulating models, rather than kind of the other side of the fence in breach simulation, which is the vendors like Scythe and others that are actually doing the testing and exploiting and backdooring and then telling you where your gaps are.
That I'm reading their article, they're talking about, incident investigation as well as security posture monitoring. That's almost starting to sound like a managed service provider as I'm reading it. May not be intended that way, but it sure seems like they're trying to offer quite a suite.
Yeah, and I think that's a better play for them, professional services as an MSSP, because I think to accomplish that attack simulation, you've got to have internal resources at some level that can do it. And the technology is getting better. A lot of vendors make a very, XM Cyber, I believe, their interface is awesome, making it super easy to go simulate like if there were an exploit and malware running around with the RDP vulnerability in my environment. Like, tell me what that would look like. And they're actually going to do it, and they make it very easy. But for a lot of smaller organizations, I totally see them going down the MSSP route for that, for sure.
Yeah.
The difference between doing it with a simulation based on configurations is that you can mark certain devices or networks or applications or systems or whatever as highly critical, and that will impact how the simulation works.
Yeah, you can do that with the commercial attack simulation products as well. I think it was Veridin, who was bought by FireEye, had a really good implementation of that. But where I think the gaps are in the like actual attack simulation versus config are all of those devices, right? You can take into account, what if someone compromises one of my main switches, right? A lot of the attack simulation frameworks don't have payloads to compromise something like a Cisco iOS or some kind of weird IoT device. But that can, if you can pull the config from it, that can be modeled, which is better. So I guess having both isn't such a bad thing, as they can cover different parts of your network and infrastructure for purposes of simulations. Speaking of risk posturing, cybersecurity risk monitoring platform Security Scorecard got $50 million in funding, which is awesome for them. And there was also an article on the 10 notable security acquisitions. And we've covered, I think, pretty much all of them. In fact, they was just on the page where they're mentioning FireEye buying Veridin for $250 million. And there's a couple on there that we haven't covered. Last week, Matt did a great job of giving us the information about what does it mean when a company gets acquired, how the different acquisitions happen, how the different funding rounds happen. So make sure you go back and listen to that, as we'll be covering more of that on this show. And it was a great introduction to all of that, and more about what it means to you when your security vendor you're using gets acquired. What does it mean? Sometimes not much. Other times, I think it can force you to have to evaluate your choices of security provider.
Oh, I second that one. Just because of my government space background, every time an acquisition happens on a product, we relook at the new company to see what that means to us, and I think everybody should. And it's work. It's challenging.
Yeah, and in your space, Lee, not easy to change gears and switch to a different vendor.
And then sometimes we can't explain to the old vendor why we left.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
It seems kind of universal too. Whenever a company gets acquired, support levels and billing and all of the things that get integrated with the new company, particularly billing, get a little hairy.
Yeah, I agree. I think depending on how the acquisition goes, it can certainly impact, especially if they're trying to integrate that technology. And Palo Alto has made a couple of acquisitions, Twistlock and PureSec, right? And they've integrated them into their platform. And I absolutely think you're correct. In that scenario, April, support's going to take a dip. Hopefully it comes, back up to an even higher level. Thanks, April. I know you have to run. But that takes time. So there can definitely be a gap there with support. Lee, one of the last articles that I did want to cover was talking about securing sensitive data inside of applications. I definitely want to explore this one a little more on Paul Security Weekly this week, but there was an article on Wired and an article on Medium, and two sites that I just, if you don't have an account with them now, it's getting really tough to read. And I think one of the to-dos on my plate is I'm going to go register a fake account somewhere and then go register for all of these sites that limit you to, I don't know if you've seen it, Dark Reading's doing it too. And I know we cover some of these in a lot of our show notes as kind of an aside, but they limit you, like Dark Reading's like 2 articles a day. And I don't know if that's based on a combination of cookies and IPs or what. But I think there's some pretty good coverage from these sites on things. So there's an article in Medium and an article in Wired, essentially on how to protect sensitive data inside of an application or inside of the database, right? And MongoDB has made a new product announcement that I didn't put in here, but I have it flagged for Paul Security Weekly for some strange reason. But that they're offering a better way to encrypt the database. And my whole thing is like, all this stuff is great. I think it does speak to risk reduction, but it doesn't eliminate the risk, because at some point a set of user credentials or a set of credentials that are inside the application have to access the data, right? An application has to read from the database, has to write to the database, and it does make it harder, right? It's not necessarily laying around a clear text config file, but it's still not impossible. And some of these articles touted as a way to prevent breaches. I'm like, maybe reduce, maybe make it more difficult for the attacker, but prevent, I think, is a stretch, Lee.
I think all we're doing is raising the bar and making it harder. For example, we talked about encryption on disk of databases, and can it be encrypted in memory and only decrypted when the record's called, so that if somebody's sitting there scraping through the system memory,
right?
Let's pretend they can't just get your whole social security table. One of the things I looked at with this list of things is they're actually, I wouldn't limit this to sensitive data. These are good basic things to do right.
In any
Never save your
application.
credentials
Yeah,
without. Yeah.
agreed.
And in fact, one of them, the never commit a transaction when it's not complete, that's sort of programming 101. I mean, that should be a mantra for all of us writing any code.
I
Yeah.
I actually
Don't get too complete.
I looked at that issue in the past week, right? How you're committing transactions to the database. And it's a fundamental software, database engineering issue. And I think
But it
that
must be occurring enough.
my security advice that I totally stole from Keith Hoodlet, and I didn't realize all of the security benefits from using a database ORM, or an interface to your database, between your application and your database, right? It basically serializes and makes it easier for your application. There's also a lot of security benefits in there too. So in Python, for example, SQL Alchemy is one such instance of that, and it allows your application to more easily interact with the database, but also has a lot of great security enhancements. Also, you're going to be looking at when you commit. It's actually a function call in there when you commit your data, and doing it when it's complete and not halfway through. And you run into issues, obviously. But there's security benefits to choosing the right technology for your application to talk to the database. And an ORM is a great thing. Keith talked about it on Application Security Weekly so many moons ago when he was the host for that show.
Well, it's something like you mentioned. You're using a standard way of doing it. You let somebody else work out how to securely interact with your database or how to securely manage your session keys. You don't write that stuff yourself. You use somebody else. You focus on creating your secret sauce, what makes your application yours. Right.
Yeah, you don't want SQL statements right inside your code, right? I mean, and you do benefit from some basic SQL injection protection as well, which is nice. And that's the other thing too, is you can go to great lengths to protect the data inside the app and inside the database, but the web app is always going to be able to read from the database at a certain point, right? And that data is going to have to be decrypted when it gets to the web browser. So, again, reduction of risk, not a complete elimination of breaches, as kind of how it was being touted.
But this is a good list. I mean, it's not a complete elimination, but this should be top of mind for folks who are creating applications. They should be looking at this.
Yep. Yeah, and I think on our previous segment, right, we talked about Stack Overflow and such. A lot of times you'll find, here's how you make it work, but now your credentials in the clear, and you always got that to do, like, I'm going to go back and clean that up. And that gets harder and harder as your application grows. So it's better to build that stuff in, just like anything. We talk about shifting left. You got to build that stuff in from the beginning. And as our code gets more modular, and DevOps is being adopted more rapidly, and so many other services exist for you to interact with over an API. I mean, we talk about security products all the time. Like almost every single one of them has an API. Almost every briefing that I do, they make sure that in the briefing they mention like, we have an open API for interoperability. Along with that API comes authentication. And those API keys have to be protected just like credentials, right? Which is why you'll see a lot of good examples from CyberArk's Conjure, and who's sponsoring the show for a while. And HashiCorp makes a pretty popular vault. And I'm looking into that implementation, and I'm going to be doing that pretty soon and talking about it on the show. So it's not something like, some code examples, Lee, right? You look at, you're like, I can go implement that, right? And only take, an hour and I'm good. Vaulting is just especially when you have a larger application, is a little more of an endeavor, a little more of a journey, right? So.
Yeah, that could be a long journey, but it's worth doing it. It's worth getting it right.
Yep.
And like you said, nearly impossible to go back and add it. This is something you need to do up front.
Well, now I have to go back. I'll admit I have to go back and add it for my application.
Right.
And so it's good. It's good for me. I lose a little sleep at night over it, the exposures, but potential exposures. But it puts me squarely in the seat that many enterprises are in today, and that is the application was developed a while ago. Maybe it was developed outside of any kind of security oversight. And I'm sure you're like, no one's sitting there going, I have none of that in my environment, right? A lot of people have that in their environment. So it puts me in that seat of having to go fix legacy code and legacy designs that aren't taking advantage of a lot of the security features. They were even available back then. I'm not saying like all the security stuff is necessarily new, but they were available back then as well. And it's a lot of work to go retrofit, right? It's your technical debt, something we talk about all the time. I got to pay back a lot of that technical debt that we wanted to move fast. We wanted to hit a deadline, and therefore security was sacrificed. Almost every enterprise, right, larger enterprise that's been in business for a while has that issue, right? Even newer companies too. Those are just the risk decisions you got to make. But going back, the longer you wait, the worse it gets, right?
And not only have you've got the issue of prioritizing what's the important deliverables. I mean, particularly if your application is broken in some way, you're gonna fix that before you roll back or back up and add an important security feature, because you've got to get back in service. And I'm sure some of the decisions you guys made in the past were about delivering service to a timeline or other driver, where stopping and adding a big security feature would just have lost you the business, and that's not what we want to do.
Right. Exactly. Cool.
All right.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for participating in this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.